Welcome to the EROS User Experience webinar series, where we talk to staff at EROS to learn more about the data, tools, and services coming out of the USGS Earth Resources Observation and Science, or EROS Center. Today's webinar is entitled EMIT, Imaging, Spectroscopy, Surface Mineralogy, and Greenhouse Gas Products and Resources Available from the LP DAAC. I'm your host, Danielle Golan, the Remote Sensing User Services Lead here at EROS in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The time is currently 12 p.m. Central, so let's go ahead and get started. First, a few logistics. To ensure the best audio experience, all participants have been muted. If you have any questions during the webinar, please enter them in the chat, and we will address those questions at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available on the LP DAAC's website and the USGS Training's YouTube channel, as well as the USGS Media Gallery in the next couple of weeks. The presentation will then also be available on the LP DAAC website. At the start and end of the webinar, we will have a few polling questions. These polls are optional, but your answers help us create a better user experience in the future. These polling questions will be available via the polls or forms feature of Teams, and I will also be adding the questions to the chat for our audience members who are not able to use those features in Teams based on your organization settings. If that feature does not work for you, please feel free to answer the questions in chat, but you only need to answer the questions once. So either answer them in the polls feature or in the chat, whichever works best for you. You should now be able to see the first set of polling questions. Today's webinar will consist of a presentation followed up by a question and answer session. Today's speaker will be Eric Bulch, a remote sensing scientist for NASA's Land Processes Distributed Active Archive Center, or LP DAAC, here at the USGS EROS. Eric's work focuses on providing user support for LP DAAC datasets and services through the creation of tutorials, scripts, and guides. Eric also supports and contributes to NASA's application for extracting and exploring analysis-ready samples, or APEARS, an application designed to make accessing and subsetting Earth science remote sensing data easy and straightforward. Eric's presentation will provide an overview of EMIT data products and resources available from the LP DAAC. Once Eric has finished his presentation, we will transition over to an optional set of final polling questions, and then we will move on to a Q&A portion of the webinar. We have several user services staff members, as well as members of the LP DAAC science team here at EROS on the line to help answer any questions you may have. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to add your questions or feedback through that webinar chat, and we'll answer those questions or feedback we receive at the end of the webinar. We will try to answer all of your questions within the time allotted, but if you're not able to address your questions during the Q&A portion, we will follow up with you offline. If there is a future webinar topic you'd like us to cover, please feel free to suggest that in the chat as well. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Eric Bulch. Take it away, Eric.
Hey, everybody. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about EMIT, kind of focus on the products available from the DAAC and some of our resources. And I'm hoping today, after this talk, everybody will have a basic understanding of the EMIT mission, know a little bit about imaging spectroscopy, and then also what products are available from the DAAC, and then where to find resources to help them work with the data. So I'm going to mention a lot of different links and websites. I believe Danielle's going to share those in the chat. They're also going to be at the end of the slideshow. The slides will be made available probably around the time the video is, so you'll be able to get back and access anything referenced here. And so, first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about the Land Processes Distributed Active Archive Center, or LP DAAC. It's located at the United States Geological Survey's Earth Resources Observation and Science Center in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And the LP DAAC organization has been part of a 30-year-long partnership between the USGS and NASA. And we host and archive land process-related data from the EMIT mission. To give a little bit of background about the EMIT mission, that's the Earth Mineral Dust Source Investigation. And so what its objective is to map mineral surface composition across the globe. And this is important because wind erodes and kicks up surface minerals. You can see some nice pictures here of dust being carried from Africa up across the ocean. And so you can see this dust can be transported vast distances, and it has an effect on radiative forcing. And so radiative forcing is essentially the change in energy flux in the atmosphere that's caused by natural or anthropogenic factors. And so here they wanted to determine essentially whether there's a net warming or cooling effect. And so depending on what type of dust, what the composition is, it'll absorb more energy when it's in the atmosphere. And so iron-rich dust, it's typically darker, will absorb more energy, while clay-rich dust, which is pale yellow or white, is more reflective. And this can have maybe a cooling effect. So the way they're mapping these dust sources is with imaging spectroscopy. And so the EMIT instrument is an imaging spectrometer. It's a push broom instrument mounted on the International Space Station. And so what that means is it scans line by line as it passes over the Earth. It has 1,200 plus parallel spectrometers. And so each one is going to capture a full spectrum of wavelengths from 450 to 2,500 nanometers. As it passes over the Earth, it builds what's called an image cube. You can think of this as like a 3D cube, like on the right, where you've got your spatial information, and then for each pixel within that space, you'll have a full spectrum, which can tell you all sorts of information about what you're looking at. For example, here in this radiant spectrum figure, the blue, green, and red channels are indicated, and you can tell sort of since there's a peak in the green that we're probably looking at vegetation because of that, and because there's the typical dip you see past the red that's related to chlorophyll absorption. And so since this full spectrum captures so much information about what's happening to photons as they make their way to the sensor, there's a lot of applications. You can map things like natural hazards, different features of aquatic ecosystems, minerals. You can look at things like wildfires. You can map greenhouse gas emissions from point sources, and you can examine different things related to water resources and the cryosphere. And so depending on your application here, there's various EMIT products. Sort of the two base ones would be the radiance, the ATS sensor, radiance, and the surface reflectance. Sort of depending on what your application is, you can use either of these products. Just to sort of highlight how the spectra relate to these things, I've got some images of different spectra, and you can see how widely the signature of things like minerals vary. If you look at the top center, you can see these are all different minerals, and they have very different features along the visible near infrared spectrum. Additionally, you can examine things like ecosystem diversity, because there is a correlation between diversity of spectra, basically the amount of colors you see versus the biodiversity in an area. This is specifically mostly focused on plants because they're stationary, and that's much easier to get information about when you're only capturing a snapshot. Additionally, you can tell things about snow and ice, like the grain size, whether it's covered in dust, all sorts of things based on the spectrum. And lastly, you can detect different gases in the atmosphere, like CO2 emissions and methane emissions. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the EMIT sensor, it does only collect data over a certain masked region. Here you can see in the bottom right the original target mask from 2022 through 2023, and this is mainly focused over arid dust source regions. Since then, the mission has been extended, and so the coverage has also been extended to include most of CONUS, or the continental United States, as well as Europe. And so this expanded coverage is still sort of limited, and that's due to downlink constraints from the International Space Station. So there's a lot of factors that go into whether data is collected over your area of interest. Besides just the mask, the instrument only is going to collect data if there's favorable solar geometry. So that means only if the sun is above a certain angle in the sky. And also because the instrument is on the International Space Station, the orbit is more complicated than if it was free-flying satellite. So there's not a standard revisit time. For the revisit time, I've got a figure here that sort of illustrates the median revisit over areas within the original target mass was about 10 to 11 per year. So you can still expect to get some coverage over most regions, but this does vary over time and based on position of the Earth and the orbit of the ISS. And one last factor that's always a concern with remote sensing images is are there clouds or not? And so if you do see black lines across the images, if you're looking at the data, this is where the onboard cloud screener has automatically remove some cloudy regions. And this happens to allow more data to be downlinked from the space station. So now that we've kind of talked about the coverage, I want to talk about the products that are available from the DAAC. I'm not going to read these on the table on the left because I'm going to talk about them all individually, but all of the data for the EMIT mission is available at no cost for download. And it's also all available in the Earth Data Cloud, which is AWS storage on the US West 2 region. And so if you're working within that cloud, you can use direct S3 access to work and process the data. And typically working right beside it is going to speed things up for you. And then I want to mention sort of the main resource, or probably the easiest resource, if you walk away with one, is going to be just the LP DAAC website. Here you can find information, and pretty much all the other links we're going to share today are somewhere on this page. And so if you want to search about a specific product, you can easily find a description, a user guide, and more information about specific products and links to our resources on this page. So now let's get into how do we find the data. So the recommended method would be to use Earth Data Search if you want to use a graphical interface, or the CMR Search API if you want to do it programmatically. Here I've got an image of Earth Data Search, and you can just search EMIT in quotes to find all the EMIT specific products. Right now there's 6, and there's actually one here that's shown because I'm logged in and I have access to one extra one. As far as this tool goes, you can use it for temporal and spatial filtering. You can add granules to a list and save that as a text file so you can access them programmatically later, or you can do some filtering and save it as a project that you can come back to later. So a lot of really nice features for working with the data through our data search. So I'll also mention the Visions tool, which you can use to find the data, and this is hosted by JPL, and it's part of the mission. The advantage here is that you can actually see forecasted coverage, which allows you to go out if you're going to do some field campaign to validate whatever data you want to collect. You can see ahead of time, think about 2 weeks, where EMIT is going to overpass in case you need to go out and do your field data collection. So now I'm going to start talking a little bit about the products. The at-sensor Radiance, which is the EMIT L1B RAD product, it's got 2 assets. It's got a Radiance asset and an observation asset. And so the observation is going to include things like sensor path length, 2 sun and 2 sensor angles, different information you might want for quality purposes. And then the Radiance is going to be your Radiance cube like I had talked about before. This is distributed in NetCDF4 format, and it's hierarchical, so it has multiple groups. The root group is going to have the data, and then there's 2 other groups, the location group, which has spatial information, and then the sensor band parameters, which has spectral information, like the full width, half max, and the wave. So if we go back to the location, this data is delivered in a non-corrected spatially raw format. So this is essentially a spectrally corrected cube from the sensor. And so with that, there is a geometry lookup table included in the location group. And what this allows you to do is reproject the scene onto a geographic grid. And this is a little different than like a geotransform. This is really just a lookup table that has indices from the raw data. And so you can use that to pull the spectra for each downtrack or cross-track position into the geographic. So the reflectance product, or estimated surface reflectance, is going to have a very similar format to the Radiance. Here there's a couple different assets. There's a surface reflectance. There's a surface reflectance uncertainty, which is the uncertainty associated with that. And then there's a mask file, which has things like a cloud mask, aerosol optical depth, and some other expanded masks for quality purposes. These are also in NetCDF4 format. Here we've got the dimensions, and those are going to be the same as the Radiance as well. One thing to note is that if you're getting the last scene from an orbit, the downtrack dimension can vary. It can be longer, so it can go up to double the size of a normal scene, which would be 2560. So that's sort of a little summary of the reflectance. The estimated mineral identification and band depth, which is the L2B product, consists of the mineral ID and band depth, and then also the mineral uncertainty. And this is also provided in a non-ortho corrected format, similarly with the geometry lookup table. And here a bit of an explanation. So there are these groups, group 1 and group 2. In this case, they don't refer to the minerals, they're referring to ranges in the absorption spectra. So group 1 is things detected within the range of the visible and 1 micron, and group 2 is things in the range of 2 2 to 2.5 microns. And this is sort of based on the tetracorder software that they use to identify the minerals. And so instead of spectral metadata, this file is going to have your mineral metadata. And so that basically has an explanation of what is the most similar target from the spectral library used to do this identification, and then also some links so you can get back and actually see the spectra of that material. So it has a URL as well as a record there. The next product is going to be the estimated methane enhancement product. And so this file is a cloud optimized GeoTIFF format, and it is already orthorectified, so it's going to be easier to work with. One thing about this is not a concentration exactly, but it's an estimate of the quantity above or below background methane concentration. And so this is provided in parts per million meters, not just parts per million. And that's because the vertical extent of plumes detected by this method, you don't really have a vertical extent. So you're not sure exactly the full size of the plume spatially. The EMIT L2B plume product, the estimated methane plume complex, is essentially a delineated plume that's made from the enhancement data. And this is identified and then confirmed by a manual review process to sort of mitigate false positives. It's also in a cloud optimized GeoTIFF, and then there's a JSON file that goes with it to help for visualizing some GIS tools. And these file sizes are based on the plume extent, so they vary. And this is probably the easiest way to work with the methane data if you're interested in doing that. Lastly, I want to talk about the aggregated mineral spectral abundance and uncertainty. This is just a single file used for Earth system models. And so it's going to have the mineral abundance for the predefined minerals of interest for this mission. And it's also in a NetCDF4 format, and each pixel is 0.5 degrees. And so just to mention again, if you go to our website, you can get a user guide, which is going to have all the details I just shared and more about each product, and then also an algorithm theoretical basis document, which sort of explains how the product is created. The EMIT mission is really leaned into open science, and so all of the workflows for processing the different products and doing the calibration and even the visualization tool, the Visions visualization tool, are all publicly available, and they're in this GitHub repository that you can go see. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about our publicly available resources. Our main repository is the EMIT Data Resources repository. This is on GitHub. Within this repository, there's guides for finding the data, guides for Earth data search, and for using CMR API to do a search in Python. And there's a bunch more that I'm going to talk through, but contributions are welcome. We really appreciate any feedback we get and try to make improvements to this regularly. And so I mentioned the geometry lookup table and the fact that the data is in raw format and needs to be orthorectified. So we have some nice Python Jupyter Notebook tutorials on how to do that, how to produce an orthorectified output, and then you can also export that and save it so it works more easily in GIS software. Within here, we've also got examples of how to extract point data. Lots of times when you're working with spectral data, you just want to extract the points and use them to build some sort of model or classifier. You can easily just take a CSV of points and extract that from the data and end up with a nice table that you can use in your model, sort of like on the right side here. We've got some simple spatial subsetting examples where you can say, since the EMIT data is very large, being about 1.8 gigabytes, you can subset that down to whatever your region of interest is, just using a polygon, and then save that example as well. And lastly, for our normal reflectance and radiance sort of data products, we have this interactive plotting tool where you can essentially hover over an RGB image of the data, and it will display what the current pixel's spectra looks like. And then you can also click to add points to the figure that'll add them to this plot on the left. And then you can also export this to the CSV. So really nice for just sort of exploring the spectra, which is usually a major part of this sort of research. Outside of the main radiance and reflectance resources, we also have some resources for the greenhouse gas products. This is for the plume product. So what we have here is the ability to find and visualize a plume extent, and then you can show that in an interactive plot. You can use this to sort of find what plumes you're interested in and see they overlap and look at them in a time series. You can also generate what's essentially a spectral fingerprint of methane. And so for this, we show an example of extracting radiance spectra, one that falls within a plume and then one that falls outside of a plume that has a similar sort of surface background. So with this figure on the left, you can see the black line here is essentially the absorption coefficient of methane. And then you can see two in and out of plume ratios, which essentially follow the same sort of signature. You can see how the methane affects the radiance if it's present. Then also we have how to build a standardized time series of a location and map all the plumes. Here it's got like a slider bar. You can move the slider and see the methane emissions from this landfill in Jordan, a bunch of different dates and times. And then we have an example of calculating the integrated mass enhancement for the kilograms of methane within the plume. And then here we have a visualization where we've plotted the mass of methane in each of the plumes from this location over time. And then we've also incorporated here whether or not there was not an observation, but there was an overpass, whether that was actually a cloud or there was no plume. Outside of those resources, we also have a PEERS. It's the application for extracting and exploring analysis-ready samples. This is our subsetting tool, and we recently added the EMIT L1B radiance and the EMIT L2A reflectance to this. You can use it to subset spatially, and what this does is it's going to reduce the amount of local computing resources that you need, and also somewhat simplify working with the data sets. If you really want to work with this data in ENVI, you can use this tool as just an ENVI converter over your region of interest, and also it'll perform a point extraction similar to what I showed in one of our other resources. And lastly, it supports orthorectified or non-orthorectified outputs, which depending on your application, you may want to stay working with non-orthorectified data. And just to sort of showcase how PEERS works, here on the left is the typical form you see to submit a request for points. You can put in a request name, and then you can upload a CSV that has coordinates. Here it'll accept up to 4 columns, so you can do an ID, a category, a latitude, and a longitude. You can upload that and it'll appear in this box on the right, or you can manually enter that information. Here I'm just submitting a request that has 50 points, and then I want to get all the EMIT data that exists from the 1st of January until the end of June of 2023. So to select those dates, and then I can select products down near the bottom. And here I've just selected the reflectance, and then I've selected all the layers. And so what this gets you with the point request is going to be a CSV file that looks something like up in the top right. It's basically just going to extract all that data, and you'll have the relevant metadata and the spectral reflectance. You can also do this to get the quality information, like from the mask or the uncertainty. And this is going to do a huge amount of data volume reduction. So to do this locally, you would have needed to download or access 27.5 gigabytes of data, but using a PEERS, you can submit this request and just get back a 12.3 megabyte CSV file. So huge amount of data reduction and reduction in the amount of work you have to do. For area requests, the form is similar and you've got sort of similar performance in terms of data reduction. So if you look at the form, the major difference here is that you can also specify your file format output, whether you want to orthorectify and what projection you want. And so here I just wanted to showcase that you can select ENVI format as an output. And so when you do that for this same sort of spatial polygon that was uploaded, it's going to return a 1-to-1 file from inputs to outputs for NetCDF. But for ENVI, there's going to be a couple extra files. You're going to have a header for each for like your reflectance, but then you'll also have a location, essentially the elevation. And then additionally, if you do a non-orthorectified request, you would have a geometry lookup table file and header also for each request. So here you're taking 27.5 gigabytes down to just 800, and you only have to download the data you choose. So great reduction, simplifying, getting data over this region. Lastly, I'll mention one more resource that we have. We have the vSphere Imaging and Thermal Applications Learning and Science repository. That's a mouthful, but you can just remember vitals. And the purpose of this repository is just to demonstrate the synergies between vSphere and thermal sensors like EMIT and EcoStress. Since they're both on the space station and they have overlapping fields of view, you can do some pretty interesting stuff with the data. And we have some example Jupyter notebooks that do things like finding concurrent data for 2 different sensors, how to process and open both these data sets. And then we also have some examples that show calculating canopy water content from EMIT and comparing that to the land surface temperature for some different classes within the Dangermond Preserve. And lastly, we will go at the NASA SPG technical interchange meeting. We're actually going to do a workshop where we walk through the vitals repository. If you're going to be at the SPG workshop, please attend. This is on May 30th. And it'll also be virtual, I believe, although I don't have the details on that. I'm sure that's something that'll be be Googleable in the near future. And so that's all I have for today. Please reach out and contact us if you have any questions. I'll pass it back to Danielle.
Great. Thank you for a great presentation, Eric. For those of the webinar, I'm adding links to the chat right now that'll have some final information about EMIT and more information about how to sign up for our next webinar. At this time, we'll now move on to our final polling questions. So I'll go ahead and turn those on, as well as add them to the chat right now. So you should now be seeing the polling questions on your screen. Again, those are optional, but please feel free to take a few minutes to answer those questions. I will also be posting in the chat right now for those of you that aren't able to use the polling feature due to your organization settings. Reminder, they are the same set of questions for the polling feature as well as in the chat. In the past, we've had some users where they couldn't use the forms feature. So you only need to answer them once. And during that time, if you have any final questions or feedback about EMIT, the LP DAAC, or any USGS EROS web-based tools, perhaps any features you'd like to see added in the future, please add those to the chat now as well. And we'll give you a few moments to answer those polling questions. All right, it does look like we have some people answering now. So with that, I don't see any specific questions in the chat, but if anyone on the line has any questions, please do feel free to let me know. The one question that I wanted to make sure we covered, Eric, you did mention Appears. How can users log into Appears? What sort of account do they need?
So to log into Appears, you just need an Earth Data login, and that's something you would need to download any EMIT data anyway. And you can, I think we've shared the link to sign up for that, and I can put it in the chat again.
Perfect, thank you. And it looks like we do have a question that came in from Mohammed, so thank you, Mohammed. How do you get EMIT 10 minerals data from the L2B products?
So there is a list of the 10 EMIT minerals. I'm not sure if that's publicly available, but you can use that to extract the data. And if you reach out to me, that's something I can find and get for you. Or if you want to get it from the EMIT team, you can join the EMIT Slack and ask, and that's something they'll happily provide.
Perfect. Thank you, Eric. See if we have any additional questions that roll in. But for right now, it looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. Don't forget, if you do have additional questions later on about EMIT or any data, tools, or services from the LP DAAC, you can always email our team at lpdaac@usgs.gov. I'll throw that email in the chat. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We hope to see you at our next webinar in the future. If you would like to be notified of upcoming webinars, please do sign up for the EROS user group by emailing custserve@usgs.gov. That link was mentioned in the chat earlier. But with that, we'll thank you all for joining us today. The team will stay on for a few more minutes in case we have any additional questions that come in. But again, thank you everyone for joining us. If you do have more questions, do feel free to add them to the chat now. And yes, if anyone on the call has any interest in joining the EMIT Slack channel, if you pass along your email to that lpdaac@usgs.gov or enter it into the chat, we'll make sure to get you added. All right, it looks like that's all the questions we have today. So thank you again, Eric, for a great presentation, and we'll conclude this webinar. Thanks again for joining us. Have a nice day.